With the death of Queen Elizabeth after 70 years on the throne of the United Kingdom, and as of head of state of Canada and selected other nations, there was general acknowledgement and appreciation of her long years of service. There were, however, some significant exceptions. Some examples. Professor Uja Anya at Carnegie Mellon University tweeted that she wished the Queen excruciating pain in dying. The linguist academic also declared Great Britain's legacy that of a thieving, raping, genocidal empire. One South African writer argued that while colonialism was history in the West, in our countries it is now, meaning that outcomes today can still ostensibly be traced to the imperial era and its policies. Time magazine writer, journalist Anisha Kohli, argued that the legacy of colonialism included slavery. Let's unpack some of these assertions. They're important to a proper understanding of history. On the question of empires, is it really the case that the British Empire in particular was akin to a 20th century tyranny such as Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union or Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler? Reasonable people should disagree with that assertion. It was Great Britain, after all, for example, that signed treaties in Canada and elsewhere, wherever they could. It was also the United Kingdom, after a U-turn on slavery, unknown in human history among any empire. It was after that U-turn, where Great Britain abolished slavery at home, then in its empire, that it began to fight slavery around the world. Its abolitionist efforts led to the deaths of 2,000 naval sailors in its attempts in the 19th century to stamp out slavery wherever it encountered it. Not every empire is created equal, and not every action under an empire is necessarily disreputable. The abolitionist efforts of the Imperial British is one such example. Also, let's consider the question of foreigners. In a perfect world, none of us would ever be ruled by someone who's foreign. But there are exceptions to the rule, or there are benefits sometimes of foreign influence, is the best way to put it. In the late 18th century and early 19th century, in parts of southwestern Germany, ruled by the French, it was Napoleonic-era reforms that removed anti-Semitic laws from the books. This was, of course, to the benefit of the Jewish population in Germany. In the American South, during the 19th century, it's quite clear that they saw the northern United States and its abolitionist efforts as interference by foreigners, and quite literally when they seceded from the United States and with the beginning of the Civil War. If you were black, though, in the American South, of course, you would have seen Abraham Lincoln and Union forces and the North and its army as liberators, because that's what they were. So not all foreign influence is, of course, necessarily bad. That being another example. Let's also take a look at success stories of some colonial-era territories. Hong Kong is perhaps the most dramatic example of this. Hong Kong in 1950 had a per capita GDP that was about 40% of that of Great Britain. In 1997, when the United Kingdom handed over the territory Hong Kong back to China, by that point, Hong Kong's per-person GDP was about 10% higher than that of its colonial mother, so to speak, Great Britain. And in fact, Hong Kong's per-person GDP was 8 times that of China, to whom it was being handed back to. When I was in Hong Kong in 2013 on business for a think tank to check out the status of economic freedom in that territory, I met business people and politicians and civil servants. Almost to a person, they said there were 3 things they wanted to keep from the British colonial era in relation to Beijing, which they saw as increasingly repressive in taking away these particular items. Those 3 things were the rule of law, including the British Legal Code, capitalism, and anti-corruption efforts from the 1970s, which had been hugely successful. The interesting thing was there was no shyness about celebrating these particular British inheritances among the people in Hong Kong that I met. And perhaps it's also why, in 2019, as the Chinese government was increasingly repressive vis-a-vis Hong Kong, that the British flag was on occasion raised in protest. It's also why, perhaps, the words of Winston Churchill, his defiant words from World War II, "We shall never surrender," were scribbled on a placard and held aloft in Hong Kong as well. And lastly, more recently, with the death of Queen Elizabeth, it's perhaps why there is an outpouring of support in Hong Kong and flowers laid at the British consulate in that territory, as a remembrance not only of Queen Elizabeth, but of the imperial connection to the territory of Hong Kong. In an age of reflexive anti-colonialism, one can be true to one's heritage and yet adopt or keep and retain certain successes introduced by foreigners into our countries, our nations, or our territories. Expressed another way, it is possible to take what's best from the past and leave the rest.